20 days. That's how long the illusion lasted. The wedding cake was still freezing in the back of the fridge, tasting like stale fondant when my mother-in-law slid a typed invoice across my new kitchen island. It wasn't for utilities. It was for rent, backdated to our wedding night. Cardboard dust has a specific smell. It's dry, a little sour, and it coats the back of your throat if you breathe it in too long. I'd been breathing it in for a week, standing in the center of the living room of our new apartment, box cutter in hand, surrounded by the debris of a merged life. David and I had been married exactly 20 days. The apartment was supposed to be our sanctuary. It was a sprawling two-bedroom on the edge of the city, technically owned by a holding company that David's mother, Brenda, controlled. When she offered it to us at our rehearsal dinner, dropping the keys into my champagne flute with a theatrical clink that made everyone at the table applaud, I felt a knot of anxiety tighten beneath my ribs. I knew Brenda. She didn't give gifts, she made investments. But David had squeezed my thigh under the table, his eyes wet with genuine gratitude. "It's rent-free for the first year," he had whispered later that night in our hotel. "Just HOA fees. She wants us to save for a house." So, I buried the knot. I packed my life into U-Haul boxes and tried to ignore the fact that the laminate flooring felt cheap and the walls were painted a sterile asylum white. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The air conditioning was broken, leaving the apartment feeling like the inside of a damp lung. I was aggressively trying to find a place for a hideous crystal gravy boat, a gift from a distant aunt, when the heavy thud of knuckles hitting the front door echoed through the hallway. David walked out of the bedroom, running a towel through his damp hair. He smelled like my coconut body wash, which he kept using because he forgot to buy his own. "Expecting someone?" he asked, tossing the towel onto a half-empty box marked Kitchen Misk. "No," I said, wiping a streak of sweat from my forehead with the back of my hand. David opened the door. Brenda stood there. She didn't look like a woman dropping in on her newlyweds. She looked like she was arriving for a deposition. She wore a tailored charcoal blazer, her hair stiff with hairspray, and she carried a rigid leather tote bag that looked heavy enough to cause blunt force trauma. Her perfume, something heavy, floral, and suffocatingly expensive, immediately overpowered the smell of cardboard dust. "Mom," David said, his posture instantly changing. His shoulders rounded, his voice crept up half an octave. "Hey, we're still unpacking." "I can see that, David," she said, stepping past him without waiting for an invitation. Her heels clicked sharply against the laminate. She ran a critical finger along the edge of the kitchen island, checking for dust. She didn't look at me. "Claire, you look flushed." "No AC," I muttered, setting the crystal gravy boat down. "Can I get you water? We don't have the coffee maker set up yet." "I'm not here to socialize," Brenda said. She unclasped her tote. The metal hardware made a sharp, metallic snick that sounded entirely too loud in the empty room. "I'm here to handle some administrative housekeeping. David, sit." David sat on a folded-up moving blanket. He looked at his knees. I stayed standing, crossing my arms over my faded t-shirt. The knot under my ribs was back, throbbing in time with my pulse. Brenda pulled a crisp, white manila envelope from her bag. She didn't hand it to David. She slid it across the kitchen island toward me. The paper made a quiet scratching sound against the quartz countertop. "What's this?" I asked, my voice flat. I didn't touch it. "Standard procedure," Brenda said smoothly. She adjusted a heavy gold ring on her right index finger. "Your lease agreement and the first month's invoice. Prorated, of course, from the 22nd. Your wedding day." The room seemed to tilt a fraction of an inch. I looked at the envelope, then at Brenda, then at David. David was suddenly incredibly interested in a loose thread on his gym shorts. I reached out and picked up the envelope. The paper felt thick, expensive. I pulled out the single sheet of paper inside. It was an invoice, complete with a professional letterhead from Brenda's holding company. Rent for Unit 4B, $3,800. Due upon receipt. I read the number 3 times. My brain refused to process the zeros. $3,800. Market rate for this neighborhood was maybe $2,000 if you stretched it. We had budgeted our entire newlywed life around the idea of paying a $500 HOA fee. "Brenda," I said, my mouth suddenly dry. My tongue felt like sandpaper against the roof of my mouth. I thought, at the rehearsal dinner, you said this was rent-free for a year, so we could save. Brenda offered a smile that didn't reach her eyes. It was a mechanical parting of lips. Oh, sweetheart, I said the down payment was free. You don't have to put down first, last, and security. That's a gift of nearly $10,000. You're welcome. I looked at David. David, I said, my voice dangerously quiet. Did you know about this? He finally looked up. His face was blotchy, a dull red creeping up his neck. Claire, look, it's a misunderstanding. Mom, I thought we talked about this. We did talk about it, David, Brenda said, her tone suddenly icy. We talked about you taking on adult responsibilities. I am not running a charity. I am running a business. I cannot have an asset sitting here hemorrhaging money because you two want to play house without paying the toll. $3,800, I repeated, the numbers tasting like ash. That's my entire monthly take-home pay. David's salary covers the rest of our bills and student loans. We physically cannot pay this. Then I suggest you figure it out, Brenda said, snapping her tote shut. Or I suggest you pack these boxes right back up. You have until Friday to wire the funds, or I'll start the eviction process. It would be a shame to have an eviction on your record before you even get your wedding photos back. She turned on her heel and walked out. The door clicked shut behind her, sealing us in the suffocating heat of the apartment. The silence she left behind was heavy, oppressive. It felt like the air pressure in the room had dropped, leaving a ringing sound in my ears. I stood completely still, staring at the typed numbers on the paper until they blurred into black streaks. I waited for David to say something. I waited for him to jump up, grab his keys, and chase his mother down the hallway. I waited for the righteous indignation, the apology, the assurance that he would fix this. Instead, he let out a long, shuddering sigh and buried his face in his hands. David. My voice didn't sound like my own. It sounded hollow, scraped out from the inside. Just give me a minute, Claire, he mumbled through his fingers. Give you a minute? I took a step toward him. The anger hadn't hit me yet. Right now, it was just shock, a cold, numbing paralysis creeping up my limbs. Did you sign a lease? Did you sign a legal document without telling me? He dropped his hands. His eyes were defensive, cornered. It was the morning of the wedding, Claire. She shoved a stack of papers at me while I was trying to find my cufflinks. She said it was just standard liability stuff for the building. I didn't read it. I trusted my mother. You trusted her, I repeated. Even though you know exactly how she operates. Even though you spent our entire engagement complaining about how she uses money to control you. What did you want me to do? He snapped, standing up. He kicked an empty box out of his way, the cardboard tearing with a harsh rip. She's my mom. She owns the place. She was doing us a favor. This isn't a favor, David. It's a trap. I slammed the invoice down on the counter. $3,800. That's not just rent. That's punitive. She wants us broke. She wants us dependent on her so she can hold this over our heads forever. You're being paranoid, he said, pacing back and forth, rubbing the back of his neck. His evasion was physical. He wouldn't make eye contact. I'll talk to her. I'll get her to lower it. Maybe to $3,000. We can make $3,000 work if we stop eating out. Stop eating out? A harsh, ugly laugh scraped out of my throat. David, we can't make $3,000 work if we stop eating, period. And that's not the point. The point is, she lied to us in front of our entire family. She didn't lie. She just communicated poorly, he muttered, deflating again. He leaned against the wall, staring at the floorboards. Look, we just need to pay it this month. Just to keep the peace. I'll pick up some overtime. It'll be fine. I stared at the man I had married less than a month ago. He looked small, diminished. He wasn't looking for a solution. He was looking for a way to surrender that didn't make him feel like a coward. I need to see the lease, I said quietly. I don't have a copy. She just took the one I signed. My stomach plummeted. You didn't keep a copy? David, you signed a legally binding document regarding our housing, and you don't even have the paperwork? I said I was distracted, he yelled, the sudden volume shocking in the empty room. Stop treating me like I'm an idiot. We're married now, Claire. We have to tackle this as a team. You can't just stand there and judge me. I'm not judging you, I said, my voice dropping lower as his got louder. I'm assessing the damage. I turned away from him and walked into the bathroom. I shut the door, locked it, and gripped the edges of the pedestal sink. The porcelain was cool beneath my sweaty palms. I looked at myself in the mirror. My hair was tied up in a messy knot, dust smeared across my cheek, my eyes wide and dark. I turned on the faucet and let the cold water run over my wrists. The sound of the rushing water drowned out whatever David was yelling from the living room. My mind was racing, connecting dots I had actively chosen to ignore over the last 2 years. The way Brenda always insisted on paying for dinners, but then dictated what we ordered. The way she generously offered to pay for the wedding flowers, but only if we used her florist, who only worked with white roses. The apartment was just the grand finale. She hadn't bought us a home. She had bought herself a terrarium, and we were the bugs trapped inside. And David. David wasn't a victim. He was a collaborator. His compliance was the currency he used to buy his mother's fleeting approval. I dried my hands on a rough towel that still smelled like the detergent from my old, tiny, cramped apartment. An apartment I had given up to move into this sterile white box. I walked back out into the living room. David was sitting on the couch we had managed to unwrap yesterday. He looked up, his expression a mix of guilt and childish hope. We'll figure it out, Claire, he said softly. I promise. I looked at the invoice on the counter. Then I looked at the mountain of boxes, filled with wedding gifts we didn't need, and things we couldn't afford to keep. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. The panic had burned away, leaving something cold and incredibly sharp in its place. Yes, I said, picking up the invoice and folding it neatly into perfect thirds. The crisp creases felt satisfying beneath my fingers. We will figure it out. But as I slipped the paper into my back pocket, I knew the we he was talking about was dead. There was no team. There was only Brenda playing her game, David letting her win, and me. And I was done playing by their rules. I walked over to the stack of flattened cardboard boxes in the corner, picked up my box cutter, and clicked the blade out. It was time to start digging. Sleep refused to come that night. I lay rigid on the air mattress we had inflated in the master bedroom, staring up at the popcorn ceiling. The streetlights outside filtered through the cheap paper blinds, casting long, bruised shadows across the floor. Beside me, David breathed in a heavy, rhythmic cadence. He had fallen asleep within 10 minutes of his head hitting the pillow, exhausted by the sheer effort of avoiding conflict. His oblivion felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I rolled over, the plastic of the air mattress squeaking loudly, but he didn't stir. He smelled like spearmint toothpaste and sweat. A week ago, I would have curled into his side. Tonight, the heat radiating off his skin made my stomach turn. Morning arrived with the abrasive beep of a garbage truck backing up in the alley below. David woke up, showered, and put on his suit. He kissed the top of my head, lingering near the door. I'll call her on my lunch break, he said, his voice carrying that forced, artificial lightness people use at funerals. Don't stress, Claire. Just focus on unpacking. Okay, I said. I didn't look up from my lukewarm mug of instant coffee. The moment the deadbolt clicked shut, I dumped the coffee down the sink. I wasn't going to unpack a single box. By 9:30, I was standing outside the glass doors of Vanguard Property Management, the holding company listed at the top of Brenda's invoice. The office was tucked into a strip mall on the south side of town, sandwiched between a discount vape shop and a dry cleaner that constantly vented the harsh, chemical smell of perchloroethylene into the parking lot. It wasn't exactly the gleaming corporate headquarters, Brenda's tailored suit suggested. I pushed the heavy glass door open. The bell above it chimed a tinny, cheerful note that completely contradicted the miserable atmosphere inside. The air conditioning was set to a freezing temperature, raising goosebumps on my bare arms. The waiting area consisted of two sagging chairs upholstered in a rough mustard yellow fabric that scratched against my jeans. Behind a scratched plexiglass partition sat a woman in her late 50s. She had reading glasses perched on the tip of her nose and was aggressively clicking a mouse, her long acrylic nails making a sharp clack, clack, clack sound. A plastic name tag pinned to her cardigan read Patty. "Can I help you?" she asked without looking up from her monitor. "I need a copy of my lease," I said, leaning closer to the cutout hole in the plexiglass. "I'm a tenant at the Oakwood building, Unit 4B. Patty stopped clicking. She peered over her glasses, her eyes scanning me from my messy bun down to my scuffed sneakers. Name? Claire. Henderson. I almost stumbled over my new last name. It felt foreign in my mouth. My husband, David Henderson, signed the paperwork a few weeks ago. We need a physical copy for our bank. We're setting up a joint checking account and they need proof of residency with both our names. It was a smooth lie. I had rehearsed it on the bus ride over, practicing the exact tone of mild administrative annoyance. Patty sighed, a long rattling exhale that smelled faintly of menthol cigarettes. Henderson, Oakwood, let me look in the physical files. Brenda usually keeps the digital copies locked down. She pushed away from her desk, her rolling chair groaning in protest, and disappeared into a back room filled with gray metal filing cabinets. I stood there for 4 minutes, listening to the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead and the muffled thump of a bass-heavy track leaking from the vape shop next door. When Patty returned, she was holding a thick manila folder. She pulled out a stapled packet of paper and fed it through an ancient Xerox machine in the corner. The machine whirred and clunked, spitting out warm, slightly crooked copies. $3 for the copy fee, she said, sliding the papers through the slot under the partition. I handed her 3 crumpled $1 bills. I didn't look at the papers until I was back out in the suffocating heat of the parking lot. I walked to my car, got in, and locked the doors. The interior was an oven. Sweat immediately began to bead on my upper lip, but I didn't turn on the engine. I just sat there, the steering wheel digging into my knees, and started to read. It wasn't a standard residential lease. The header read, Commercial Guarantor Agreement and Subtenancy Contract. I am not a lawyer, but I work in logistics. I know how to read a contract, and I know how to look for clauses designed to screw someone over. Brenda hadn't just drafted a rental agreement, she had drafted a financial straitjacket. According to the paperwork David had blindly signed on the morning of our wedding, we weren't just tenants. We were liable for the property taxes. We were liable for all maintenance, structural or otherwise. But the most glaring, ridiculous clause was buried on page 4, section 12, paragraph C. Tenant agrees that rent is subject to dynamic market adjustment at the absolute discretion of the landlord without prior notice to reflect current holding company liabilities. She could charge us $3,800 today and $5,000 tomorrow, and David had initialed right next to it. I flipped to the signature page. There was David's sloppy scrawl, the blue ink bleeding slightly into the cheap paper, but right beneath his signature was a blank line designated for the co-tenant, spouse. It was completely empty. My heart did a strange, painful flutter against my ribs. Because I wasn't there on the morning of the wedding, my signature was missing. And in our state, a lease for a primary marital residence requires the signatures of both spouses if the property is occupied by both, especially when asserting joint financial liability. Without my signature, this piece of paper was legally shaky at best and completely unenforceable against me at worst. But that wasn't the detail that made me sit up straight. It was the name of the holding company listed at the bottom, Vanguard Property Management, LLC. I pulled out my phone, my thumb slightly damp with sweat, and opened the browser. I went to the county tax assessor's public database. I typed in the address of our apartment building. The page loaded slowly, fighting my weak cellular connection. When the data finally populated, I read the ownership details. The property wasn't owned by Vanguard Property Management, LLC. It was owned by Brenda Henderson as an individual. I frowned. wiping a drop of sweat from my chin. I scrolled down to the tax history. Right there, in glaring black and white pixels, was a bolded line item under the 2025 tax assessment. Exemptions claimed. Primary homestead. A cold, sharp laugh erupted from my throat. It startled me, sounding loud and harsh in the confined space of the car. Brenda was claiming the apartment as her primary personal residence to get a massive tax break from the state. You can only claim a homestead exemption on a property you physically live in. You cannot legally claim it on an investment property, and you absolutely cannot claim it on a unit you are actively renting out for profit. She wasn't just being a terrible mother-in-law, she was committing state tax fraud. And by giving us a fake commercial lease under a shell company that didn't even own the building, she was attempting to illegally extort rent to cover her own fraudulent tracks. I carefully folded the copied lease and placed it in my purse. The knot of anxiety that had been living under my ribs for 20 days finally dissolved. It was replaced by something else. Something heavy, cold, and entirely merciless. Returning to the apartment felt different this time. The white walls didn't look like a sterile asylum anymore. They looked like a blank canvas. I walked through the living room, sidestepping the boxes, and went straight to the kitchen counter. The original invoice Brenda had dropped off was still sitting there, right where I had left it. I smoothed it out, placing it side by side with the copied lease and my phone displaying the county tax records. My marriage was crumbling in real time, but oddly, I didn't feel like crying. The grief was there, sure. It hummed in the background, a low-frequency ache at the base of my skull. I mourned the man I thought David was. I mourned the life I thought we were building. But mostly I felt a profound sense of clarity. David came home at 6:30. The front door clicked open, and he walked in carrying a greasy brown paper bag that smelled overwhelmingly of fried garlic and soy sauce. "Hey," he called out, his voice excessively cheerful. He dropped his keys into the ceramic bowl by the door. "I got Golden Dragon. Your favorite." I was sitting on a bar stool at the kitchen island. I had put the lease and the tax records away, leaving only the invoice on the counter. "Thanks," I said, watching him unpack the plastic containers. He was moving a little too fast, deliberately avoiding my eyes. "So," he started, ripping open a packet of duck sauce with his teeth. "I talked to my mom today." "Did you?" I kept my voice neutral. I focused on the texture of the quartz countertop beneath my fingertips. "Yeah. Look, she's stressed. The holding company had some unexpected expenses, and she panicked. That's why the invoice was so high." He scooped a massive portion of lo mein onto a paper plate and slid it toward me. I talked her down. She agreed to lower the rent to $2,000 a month. "That's totally manageable, Claire. We can afford $2,000. He looked up at me, offering a hopeful, boyish smile. It was the same smile he used when he forgot to take out the trash, or when he spent too much money on golf clubs. It was a smile designed to disarm, to beg for forgiveness without actually taking accountability. $2,000, I repeated softly. "Yeah, see? I handled it. We're a team." He took a massive bite of a pot sticker, chewing loudly. "We just need to wire her the first month by Friday, like she asked, to show good faith. Then she'll draft a new lease." The lie was so clumsy it almost insulted me. Brenda hadn't compromised. She had realized $3,800 was impossible to squeeze out of a stone, so she lowered the number to something we would bleed ourselves dry to pay. And David was selling it to me as a victory. "I see," I said. I pushed the paper plate of noodles away. The smell of the fried oil was suddenly nauseating. "Did she mention the fact that I never signed the original lease?" David stopped chewing. His jaw froze. A tiny drop of soy sauce fell from his chopstick and landed perfectly on the white laminate floor. "What?" he mumbled, swallowing hard. "I didn't sign it, David. Only you did." "Well, yeah, you were getting your hair done, but we're married. It applies to both of us." He waved a hand dismissively, but a faint sheen of sweat had appeared on his forehead. "Don't get caught up in the technicalities. We just need to pay the $2,000 and move on. I'm not paying her a dime." The words hung in the air, sharp and absolute. David slammed his chopsticks down on the counter. They bounced, one clattering onto the floor. "Claire, stop being stubborn. I fixed the problem." Why do you always have to make things so difficult? She's my mother. Because it's a scam, David. I stood up. I didn't yell. I didn't need to. The quietness of my voice made him flinch. She doesn't want rent. She wants control. And you are handing it to her on a silver platter because you are too terrified of her to say no. That is deeply unfair, he said, his face reddening. He gripped the edge of the counter. You don't understand how she operates. If we fight her on this, she'll make our lives hell. She'll evict us. She'll ruin my credit. She can't evict us based on a lease I never signed, I countered, leaning closer. And she definitely can't evict us legally when she's claiming this apartment as her primary homestead for tax evasion. David blinked. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a splotchy, sickly gray. What did you just say? You heard me. I turned around and grabbed my laptop from the sofa. I opened it, brought up the downloaded PDF from the tax assessor's office, and turned the screen toward him. She doesn't live here, but she's telling the state government she does. If she files an eviction notice with the courts, she exposes her own fraud. David stared at the screen. He read the lines of text over and over again, his mouth slightly open. I watched the realization hit him. It wasn't the realization of his mother's criminality. It was the realization that he was caught in the middle of a war he couldn't negotiate his way out of. Where did you get this? He whispered. I spent my day being an adult, I said, shutting the laptop with a sharp snap, while you spent yours begging for a discount on our extortion. He ran a trembling hand through his hair. Claire, you can't use this. If you report her, she could face massive fines. She could lose her broker's license. It would destroy her. I haven't reported anything yet, I said calmly, but I'm not writing that check, and I'm not staying in this apartment. What do you mean you're not staying? Panic laced his voice now, high and tight. Where are you going? I don't know yet, I lied. I had already booked a cheap extended stay motel near the airport, but I'm giving you a choice, David. Right here. Right now. You can pack your bags tonight, come with me, and we let your mother deal with her own messes. Or you can stay here, wire her the money, and be her perfect, compliant little tenant. He looked around the apartment, at the boxes we hadn't unpacked, at the cold, half-eaten Chinese food on the counter. He looked everywhere, except at me. Claire, be reasonable, he pleaded, his voice breaking. She's my family. I can't just abandon her. Let me talk to her again. With this tax thing, I can get her to drop the rent entirely. We can stay here for free. Really for free this time. He still didn't get it. He thought the leverage was a bargaining chip for a better deal. He didn't realize the leverage was the only way to amputate a rotting limb. I looked at my husband, the man I had promised my life to 20 days ago. He looked small, terrified, and fundamentally broken. Okay, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I felt a strange, hollow peace settle over me. Okay, David, you talk to her. I turned around and walked into the bedroom. I pulled my old canvas duffel bag from the closet. The zipper snagged, a harsh, grinding sound in the quiet room. I started pulling clothes off the hangers. I didn't fold them. I just shoved them in. I wasn't waiting for him to talk to her, because I had already set up a meeting with Brenda for the next morning, and I wasn't bringing David. Thursday morning tasted like old pennies. I sat in a secluded booth at an artisan roastery downtown, the air smelling intensely of burnt caramel and bitter citrus. My cuticles were picked raw, and a cold, clammy sweat glued my thin shirt to my spine. I took a sip of water, the ice clinking against the glass, sounding fragile and entirely too loud in the morning quiet. Brenda arrived at exactly 8:30, parting the line of sleepy, caffeinated commuters like a shark moving through a reef. Wearing a bone-white trench coat and carrying her weaponized leather tote, she spotted me in the corner. Her mouth tightened into a microscopic line of irritation. She slid into the booth across from me. The leather seat groaned in protest. I have a 9 o'clock, Claire, Brenda said, aggressively checking her gold watch. David said you had a bit of a breakdown last night. I assume you're here to apologize for the theatrics and give me the check. I looked at her. Really? looked at her. For 2 years, I had seen an intimidating matriarch whose approval I desperately wanted. Today, sitting across from her in the harsh light, I just saw an exhausted, greedy woman covering her tracks with expensive tailoring. "I don't have a check, Brenda," I said, grounding my voice deep in the base of my throat. "I have paperwork." I pulled the manila envelope from my canvas bag, placing the tax records and the lease copy flat on the reclaimed wood table. "I'm not doing this," Brenda sighed, rolling her eyes. "I don't have time for amateur legal dramatics." Section 12, paragraph C, I interrupted, pressing my index finger hard onto the top page. "Dynamic market adjustment without notice. That's illegal for a residential lease." More importantly, the signature line for the spouse is entirely blank. I never signed it. Brenda's manicured fingernail tapped the table. "Tick, tick." David signed it. "You're his dependent in the eyes of my holding company. If you don't pay, I'll garnish his wages. I'll ruin his credit for a decade to teach you both a lesson." "You don't have a holding company," I said quietly. The ticking stopped. I slid the second piece of paper over the lease. The county tax assessor's printout, the homestead exemption line, highlighted in bright, obnoxious neon yellow. "You own the building in your individual name," I continued, "and you claim Unit 4B as your primary residence to dodge the massive property tax bump. If you try to garnish his wages, you have to present the lease in court. The moment a judge sees you charging rent on your designated homestead, the county assessor gets an automatic flag." Brenda sat perfectly still. The ambient noise of the cafe instantly muted in my ears. Blood drained from her face, leaving her foundation looking chalky against her skin. "You little bitch," she whispered. Her voice was pure, unfiltered venom, smelling faintly of peppermint and black coffee. "Here are my terms," I said. "A cold clinical detachment, completely replacing my nausea. You rip up David's lease right here. You text him right now, stating the debt is forgiven due to an administrative error. If you do that, I don't report the tax fraud. You keep your money and your real estate license." Brenda glared at me, the tendons straining against her neck. I watched her calculate the cost of a bruised ego against the catastrophic reality of a state tax audit. I saw the exact moment the math worked out. Her jaw unlocked. Without breaking eye contact, she reached into her tote, typed aggressively, and threw her glowing phone onto the table. "Lease is void. My mistake. Don't worry about the rent." "There," she spat. "You win. I hope you're happy. You've just alienated your husband's only family." "He isn't my husband anymore," I said, grabbing my bag. "He's your tenant, and he always will be." I walked out into the blinding glare of the morning sun. The air was thick with exhaust fumes. But as I walked to my car, my lungs expanded. For the first time in 20 days, I could actually breathe. I drove back to the apartment one last time. David had left for work. The white walls still looked like a sterile asylum, the boxes of wedding gifts sitting in the corner as a cardboard monument to a future that would never happen. A heavy, oppressive silence hung in the room. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from David. "Mom just texted. She dropped it. I told you I could handle her. Chinese tonight to celebrate?" I stared at the black screen, reflecting my own exhausted face. He hadn't handled anything. Relieved the boot had been lifted from his neck, he was completely unaware he was still living inside the cage. The urge to scream the truth at him through the glass flared up, hot and painful. But what was the point? He was a man who preferred the illusion of peace to the friction of the truth. He fundamentally didn't want to be saved. He just wanted comfort. I didn't take the expensive stand mixer or the Egyptian cotton sheets. I packed exactly what I brought into the marriage. My clothes, worn paperbacks, mismatched mugs, and my battered French press. The zipper snagged with a definitive, loud sound. I left my wedding ring deliberately in the exact center of the original typed invoice on the kitchen island. The small diamond caught a sliver of light, looking tired and entirely out of place. I picked up my bag, the canvas strap, a solid, grounding weight on my shoulder. The heavy front door clicked shut behind me, the deadbolt engaging with a final, metallic thud. The cardboard dust still lingered in the back of my throat, but the sour taste was finally, irrevocably, gone. Walking away from a marriage is never easy, but walking away from a trap is simply survival. Sometimes the people who claim to love you are just looking for someone to control, and the only way to win their game is to completely refuse to play. If my story resonated with you, please hit that like button, share this video with someone who might be struggling with toxic in-laws, and subscribe to the channel for more real, raw stories of taking your life back.